Ruth Callahan sat across a cold conference table in a notary's office in Millbrook, Vermont, her 61-year-old hands trembling around a pen her own son had pressed into her fingers. Outside the window, a moving truck idled in the driveway of the house she had scrubbed, painted, and prayed inside of for 34 years. Daniel tapped the signature line with one impatient finger, and Lauren kept checking her watch, like her mother's entire life was an appointment that was already running late, an inconvenience to be finished quickly before lunch. Nobody sitting in that office remembered the one thing Ruth's late father used to whisper to her when she was a girl standing behind the counter of his little diner on Route 9. "Never sell the diner, Ruthie," he had told her. "Whatever happens, whatever anybody tells you it is worth, you hold on to it." She had nodded back then without understanding a single word of what he meant. And if you have ever been discarded by the very people you carried, fed, and forgave 1,000 times over, if you have ever been made to feel small at your own table, this story was written for you. What Ruth did not know yet, signing away the life she had spent 3 decades building, was that her father had left her something far heavier than a $1 deed to a failing diner nobody wanted. Something sealed beneath that kitchen floor for 28 years, untouched, waiting, was about to turn her children's greed into the worst mistake either of them would ever make. Subscribe now, because what Ruth Callahan was about to find in that cellar would prove, once and for all, that justice keeps a ledger of its own, patient and exact, and it never once forgets an address, no matter how many years pass before it finally comes calling. Ruth Callahan married Michael Callahan in the spring of 1992 in a small stone church outside Millbrook, Vermont, wearing her mother's altered wedding dress because there had been no money left over for a new one. 34 years later, when Michael passed from a sudden heart attack 3 years before this story began, Ruth had spent more than 3 decades of her life being exactly what a marriage and a family needed her to be, nothing more and never, ever less. She had ironed his shirts every single Sunday night without fail, kept the household running on a school teacher's modest salary and her own part-time wages from the diner counter and later the hospital cafeteria, and she never once, in all that time, asked for anything back in return. She believed, in the deepest and most private part of herself, that devotion was simply supposed to work that way, quiet, unspoken, endless, a debt that only ever ran in one direction. Michael had taught 7th grade history at Millbrook Middle School for 29 years, a gentle, forgetful man who loved her in his own quiet way, and together they raised their 2 children in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street that Ruth had wallpapered with her own 2 hands one summer when money was too tight to hire it done. Nobody in her family had ever once told her otherwise, so she never questioned it, not one single time. Not even when questioning it might have finally saved her from what was coming. She kept her own small hopes tucked away quietly instead. A garden she never got to plant. A trip to the coast she never got to take. Small private dreams folded up and set aside for a someday that never quite arrived. A someday she had stopped mentioning out loud somewhere around her 40th birthday. She raised Daniel and Lauren from the moment they were born, and she raised them with everything she had, or so she believed with her whole exhausted heart. She sat up through fevered nights when Daniel was only 4 years old, cooling his forehead with a wet towel until dawn. She drove Lauren 40 minutes each way to dance lessons for 9 straight years, rain or ice or exhaustion, never once complaining out loud. She worked double shifts at the Millbrook Community Hospital cafeteria for 11 consecutive years just to help cover the $18,000 tuition gap at the state college. Neither child could have afforded on their own, coming home smelling of steamed vegetables and industrial soap long after midnight, and rising again at 6 to make breakfast like nothing had cost her a thing. She never missed a single church potluck at St. Andrew's, never missed a school play, a graduation ceremony, or a birthday, not one, In 38 combined years of raising 2 children who grew taller than her, and, somewhere along the way, grew distant too. She gave so freely and so completely, and asked for so little in return, that eventually her own family simply stopped noticing she was owed anything at all, stopped noticing her at all, really, except when something was needed: a ride, a loan, a favor, a signature on some form. Nobody bothered explaining fully to her first, before disappearing again back into their own busy, separate lives. The humiliations came small at first, small enough that she barely allowed herself to name them as humiliations, rather than simple bad manners. There were Christmas dinners where her opinion on the menu was overruled without so much as a discussion. Her favorite dishes quietly dropped from the table. There were birthdays where Daniel forgot to call until 9 at night, if he remembered to call at all, and Lauren sent a text instead, 3 words, and an emoji. There were family decisions made in group chats she was quietly left out of entirely. Decisions about vacations, about property, about their late father's estate, decisions that always seemed to happen after the fact instead of before it, as though her vote had already been counted and dismissed. There was the time Lauren corrected her mother's grammar in front of dinner guests and laughed, and the time Daniel borrowed $4,000 for a car repair and never once mentioned paying it back. She swallowed every single one of these moments, because that was what a good mother did, she told herself again and again. She absorbed the sting and smiled through Sunday dinner like nothing at all had happened, like nothing ever happened, like the ache in her chest was simply hers to carry alone, the way it always had been, the way she assumed it always would be for the rest of her days, right up until the day she found out just how wrong that assumption truly was. Long before Michael, long before Daniel and Lauren were even born, there had been her own father, Frank Callahan, who ran Callahan's Corner Diner on Route 9 for nearly 40 years of his life, through blizzards and gas shortages and 3 separate recessions. Frank was stubborn, fiercely proud, and almost pathologically private about money. The kind of man who counted the cash register twice every single night, wrote the total in a leather ledger he never let anyone else touch, and never once discussed numbers at his own dinner table, not even the year the diner nearly closed for good, and Ruth's mother begged him, uselessly, to just tell her how bad things really were. Ruth had grown up behind that counter, refilling ketchup bottles, wiping down cracked red vinyl booths, and stacking coffee cups at 5 years old, standing on an overturned milk crate, listening to truckers and farmers, and the same 6 regulars argue about weather and baseball every single morning at exactly 7:15. She loved her father with the uncomplicated, total devotion of a child who never once doubted him, not even when his silences stretched long, strange, and unexplainable, not even when he locked the diner early some Tuesdays and told her only that grown-up business needed tending to. Business he never once brought home to discuss over supper, not even with her mother. In the fall of 1998, Frank got into a bitter, ugly boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher named Earl Whitfield over 26 acres of land directly behind the diner, a dispute that dragged through the Millbrook County Courthouse for the better part of an entire year, draining Frank's savings and his patience in equal measure, and turning a once friendly neighbor into a man who would not even nod to him at the feed store anymore. And then, one week that October, without a single word of explanation to anyone, Frank disappeared into the diner's old cellar for 7 straight days, hauling down lumber, tools, and a mason's trowel, while customers wondered aloud if he had lost his mind entirely. The county surveyor's office had gotten involved by that December, and rumors ran up and down Route 9 that Frank might lose the whole back parcel to Earl Whitfield's lawyers before the first snow fell that year, a rumor Frank never once bothered to confirm or deny to anyone in town. When he finally emerged from the cellar, dust caked in his gray hair and something unreadable burning behind his eyes, all he ever said to Ruth, his only child, was that some things were far safer left buried than fought over in a courtroom full of strangers who had never once earned the right to them. He never spoke of that week again, and neither, out of some instinct she never quite understood, did Ruth. Ruth never once forgot the locked hatch beneath a loose floor tile near the diner's counter, the exact spot her father always steered her small feet away from, without ever explaining why, not once, not in 22 years. She remembered the cold iron ring bolted into that tile, the way her father's boot would nudge her gently sideways whenever she wandered too close while mopping the floor after closing. She had asked him about it exactly twice in her life, once at 16, and once the year before he died, and both times he had simply changed the subject, patted her hand twice like punctuation, and told her not to worry about things that were not yet hers to carry. Not yet. Not for a long while still. And there was something in the way he said it that always made her stomach tighten, just slightly. Sitting now, decades later, in that cold notary's office signing away everything she had spent a lifetime building, Ruth felt an old and painfully familiar unease rise up through her chest. The very same unease she had felt as a girl standing frozen over that hatch. The quiet, nagging sense that her father's silence about that diner had never truly been about the diner at all, and that somewhere, some part of him had always known this exact day might come, and had quietly prepared for it, decades in advance, without ever once telling her so directly. It started, as these things so often do, with a family meeting. Daniel called on a Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks after Michael's funeral, while Ruth was still wearing black to church out of habit, rather than requirement. Daniel slid a thick folder across her own kitchen table and explained, in the calm, patient voice he used for people he considered slower than himself, that a power of attorney was simply routine paperwork, something every responsible family arranged after a loss like this one. Lauren nodded along beside him, agreeing before Ruth had even finished a single sentence of her own, her eyes on her phone more than on her mother's face. Daniel used words like fiduciary and estate efficiency, words Ruth had never once needed in 34 years of managing a household on faith and careful budgeting, and every time she asked a simple question, he answered it as though she had asked something faintly embarrassing. Between the two of them, Ruth felt something small and important quietly closing around her, like a door she had not noticed swinging shut, latch clicking so softly she almost mistook the sound for nothing at all, the way she had mistaken so many small warnings for nothing at all across 34 years of practiced patience. Ruth signed that folder at her own kitchen table 3 days later, trusting her children the way she had trusted them her entire life, the way a mother trusts the two people she raised to eventually, someday, return even half of what she had given them. She told herself this was simply Daniel being responsible, Lauren being practical, her children finally stepping up the way grown children were supposed to when a parent needed help. She had no earthly idea, signing her name in blue ink beneath theirs, that she was handing over the keys to everything she had spent 34 years building. Daniel had smiled at her that day, a small, satisfied smile she mistook, in the moment, for gratitude, and Lauren had squeezed her shoulder once and told her this was exactly what Dad would have wanted, an assurance Ruth clung to for weeks afterward, like a small warm stone in her pocket, turning it over and over in her mind on nights when doubt crept in uninvited. She had no lawyer of her own review those papers, no second opinion, no one at all standing in her corner, because in 34 years of marriage and motherhood, it had simply never once occurred to her that she might need protection from the very people she had raised with her own 2 hands. 3 weeks after that signature, Ruth returned home from the Wednesday evening prayer group at St. Andrew's to find a moving truck backed halfway up her own driveway on Maple Street, 2 men she had never seen before carrying her armchair, her wedding china, and Michael's old recliner out through the front door like it was any ordinary Tuesday. Daniel stood on the lawn directing traffic with a clipboard, not even looking up when her car pulled in, checking items off a list like he was managing a simple estate sale rather than dismantling his own mother's life. When she asked him, voice shaking, what exactly was happening to her house, he told her flatly that the house had already been listed and sold 3 weeks earlier under the authority she herself had signed over, and that the money from the sale was, quote, better managed elsewhere now, somewhere she would not need to think about it. She stood there in her Wednesday prayer group cardigan, watching 2 strangers carry the life she had built out onto the street in cardboard boxes labeled in Daniel's handwriting, and she realized, with a sick lurch, that she had not been consulted about a single detail of any of it. Not the price, not the buyer, not even the date the movers were scheduled to arrive, as though her opinion on any of it had stopped mattering the moment she signed that folder at her own kitchen table. The grief hit her twice that afternoon, once for the house itself, and once, deeper and colder, for the realization that grief over Michael had somehow become the very opportunity her children needed. She stood on her own front lawn in the fading October light, watching strangers carry away 34 years of a life piece by piece, the porch swing Michael built the summer Daniel turned 10, the quilt her own mother had stitched, all of it loaded onto a truck bound for someone else's profit. She named the feeling silently to herself, because there was no one left standing beside her to name it for her. Humiliation, disbelief, a grief so total it had nowhere left to go but down into her stomach like a stone, sinking further with every box that passed her on the lawn. She thought of Michael, gone only 6 weeks, and wondered, standing there in the cooling October air, whether he would even recognize the children they had raised together if he could see them now, directing strangers to carry away his recliner like it was nothing more than curbside trash left out for the county to collect. She called Daniel that night, and he answered on the 4th ring, sounding faintly annoyed, as if she were interrupting something far more important than her own eviction. When she asked where she was supposed to sleep that very night, he suggested, almost cheerfully, that she could rent a small apartment somewhere in town with what was left over after expenses, though he never once specified what those expenses were or who exactly was collecting them. He reminded her that everything he had done for the family's financial future, a future that apparently no longer required her name, her address, or her signature to be on file anywhere that mattered. She hung up the phone that night and sat alone in her car in a church parking lot for nearly an hour, engine off, hands folded in her lap, because for the first time in her adult life, she genuinely did not know where she was supposed to go next, or who, if anyone left in this world, still had room for her. It was 2 nights later, staying in Lauren's guest room out of sheer necessity because she had nowhere else in the world to go, that Ruth overheard the conversation that would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. Through the thin drywall, on the phone with Daniel, Lauren's voice carried clearly enough, low and businesslike. "Mom is a liability we need off the books before the estate stuff gets complicated," she said, laughing lightly at something Daniel said back on the other end. "Don't worry, she'll be fine. She always just goes along with whatever we tell her. She always has. Mom doesn't fight. She never has. That's just who she is. It's actually kind of convenient if you think about it." Ruth sat frozen on the edge of the guest bed, both hands pressed flat over her mouth so no sound would escape. A liability. Off the books. Words that belonged in a business ledger, not in a daughter's mouth describing her own mother, the same mother who had driven that daughter 40 minutes each way to dance lessons for 9 straight years without ever once being late, without ever once complaining, without ever once asking what it cost her. Something shifted inside Ruth that night, quiet and permanent, a small cold seed of resolve planted where only grief had lived before, though she would not fully understand its shape for weeks yet to come. The notary's office came next, the same cold room where this story began, Daniel scrolling stock prices on his phone through the entire reading of the final paperwork, while Ruth's hands shook around a pen someone else had placed there. Lauren checked her watch twice in 10 minutes, sighing once when the reading ran long. The notary, a tired-looking woman named Carol Ashby, who had clearly seen this exact scene play out with other families before, read aloud in a flat professional voice that the retirement account Ruth and Michael had built together over 3 decades, $340,000 in careful, patient savings, had already been transferred into a joint family trust account that Ruth herself was not listed on, was not even permitted to view, let alone withdraw a single dollar from. Ruth heard the number out loud, 340,000, and felt the room tilt slightly, the way it had felt standing at Michael's graveside, a grief with a dollar amount attached to it now, cold and exact. $340,000 of quiet sacrifice reduced to a single line on a form she was not even permitted to sign. At the bank 2 days later, a teller named Priya Malhotra, apologetic and clearly uncomfortable, typed Ruth's account number in twice before confirming what Ruth already feared in her bones. The joint account she and Michael had shared for decades now showed a balance of $11.42. Neighbors in line behind her shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear, while Ruth stood at the counter, absorbing a single number that represented the complete and total erasure of 34 years of careful, disciplined saving, coupon clipping, and going without so that her children would never have to. She walked out of that bank into the gray afternoon light and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, unsure for the first time in her life what a person was even supposed to do next when there was simply nothing left. At the family dinner that followed, the last one Ruth would ever attend in that family's presence, Lauren rolled her eyes so visibly that even Daniel's wife looked down at her plate when Ruth asked quietly whether anything at all could still be salvaged from the house sale. "You're being dramatic," Lauren said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Honestly, it's kind of pathetic watching you cling to money that was never really going to be yours to manage anyway. Mom, you've never managed anything bigger than a grocery list in your whole life, so let the grown-ups handle it from here," she added, and not one person at that table told her to stop. 2 days later, Daniel handed Ruth a manila envelope on the courthouse steps, told her flatly that this settled everything fair and square between them now, and walked away without so much as waiting for a response, already checking his phone before he reached the bottom step. Inside the envelope was a single crumpled dollar bill paper-clipped to a deed for Callahan's Corner Diner, the failing, dust-covered roadside diner her own father had left behind 22 years earlier on Route 9, a place Daniel clearly believed was worth nothing at all, a joke of an inheritance, a final insult, dressed up carefully as a gift. Ruth stood on those courthouse steps holding the envelope with both hands, and for one long, silent moment, neither Daniel's retreating back nor the crumpled dollar bill made a single sound in her mind at all. Ruth stood on that courthouse curb with one packed suitcase, a single crumpled dollar bill, and a deed to a diner nobody wanted. And something inside her, some quiet, patient thing that had been waiting 34 years to finally wake up, did exactly that. She had nothing left to lose now, nothing at all, no house, no savings, no children who called her anything but a liability. And for the first time since Michael's funeral, that terrifying fact felt less like an ending, and strangely more like a door swinging open onto something she could not yet see. She decided, standing right there on that curb with the wind picking up around her, that she would drive to Millbrook and see this worthless diner with her own 2 eyes before one more person told her what it was or was not worth. 61 years old, penniless by every measure that mattered to a bank, and utterly, completely done, being told who she was by the 2 people who should have known her best, and who, of everyone alive, understood her least of all. Ruth drove her aging Honda Civic north out of the city that same afternoon, the crumpled dollar bill and the diner deed sitting on the passenger seat beside her like the only 2 things left that still belonged to her in the entire world. The drive to Millbrook took just under 2 hours, past white church steeples and covered bridges, and long stretches of Vermont farmland gone gold with early autumn. And somewhere around the second hour, Ruth caught herself rehearsing, out loud, alone in the car, exactly what dignity was even supposed to feel like now that everyone who owed it to her had stopped paying. She gripped the wheel with both hands and made herself a small, quiet promise that whatever waited at the end of this road, she would meet it standing up straight. 61 years old, widowed, homeless by every legal definition that mattered, and driving toward a $1 inheritance, her own son had handed her like an insult, and still, somehow, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruth Callahan felt something that resembled the very beginning of freedom, faint and unfamiliar, like a window cracked open in a house that had been sealed shut for years. The diner came into view just past a rusted gas station sign, smaller than she remembered from the 1 or 2 childhood visits she still carried in memory. Its Callahan's Corner sign faded nearly white by decades of sun, 2 front windows boarded over with warped plywood. It looked, by any honest measure, exactly as worthless as Daniel had assumed it would be. And yet, something about the town itself felt strangely, unexpectedly warm toward her. An older woman sweeping her porch across the street lifted a hand in greeting like she had been half expecting Ruth's car for weeks, and a man loading firewood outside the hardware store nodded once, slow and certain, as though he already knew exactly whose daughter had just pulled in. It was such a small thing, a wave, a nod, and yet Ruth realized, sitting there with the engine ticking as it cooled, that it had been months since anyone had looked at her like she mattered at all, let alone like she was expected, like her arrival mattered to anyone at all. She was still standing in the gravel lot, key in hand, when a stooped silver-haired man in a canvas jacket ambled over from the hardware store with the unhurried gait of someone who had nowhere urgent left to be. He introduced himself as Walter Higgins, 68 years old, retired county surveyor, and said he had worked Millbrook's land records for 40 years and known her father Frank about as well as any man in 3 counties. "You're Frank's girl," he said, studying her face for a long moment, like he was checking it against a photograph kept somewhere in his memory for over 20 years. "There is something under that floor, Ruth. Your father always meant for you to be the one who found it, not them, whoever they are." Ruth felt her breath catch somewhere between her ribs, half certain the old man was simply confused, half certain, for reasons she could not yet name, that he was telling her the plain and simple truth, the kind old men in small towns rarely bother inventing. Ruth's hand shook, though not from cold, as she fit the old brass key into the diner's stubborn front lock, the same lock her father had turned 10,000 mornings before her. The door groaned open onto a room thick with dust and silence, cobwebs strung between stools that had not held a customer in years, sunlight slicing through the boarded windows in narrow gold bars across a floor she had not walked in over 2 decades. And there, near the base of the old counter, one square tile sat very slightly raised above the others, exactly where her father's boot had always steered her small feet away as a girl, waiting now, after 28 years, for her feet alone to finally find it. Walter stood quietly in the doorway behind her, watching, saying nothing more, as Ruth Callahan took her first step toward the counter and the small raised tile that had waited a lifetime, patiently, quietly, just for her. Walter Higgins did not simply believe Ruth was Frank Callahan's daughter. He could prove it, and he proved it methodically, the way a man who had spent 40 years filing county land records always would. He walked her 3 blocks down Main Street to the Millbrook County Clerk's office that same afternoon, pulled the original 1958 deed showing Frank's father first purchasing the diner parcel, and stood beside Ruth while a clerk named Donna Pratt confirmed in plain black and white that Ruth Callahan was listed as sole surviving heir on file, her claim to the property beyond any legal question. It was the first time in weeks that anyone in any official capacity had looked at Ruth and confirmed, without hesitation, that she was exactly who she said she was. Donna Pratt even pulled a second file, an old assessment record from 1999 that Frank himself had quietly amended just months after the boundary dispute settled, a small procedural update almost no one would have thought to look for, listing Ruth, and only Ruth, as the designated future owner of both the diner building and the land recorded beneath it. Walter squeezed her shoulder once, the way an old friend does rather than a stranger, and told her plainly that whatever waited back at that diner, the law itself was already standing on her side of it, quietly, patiently, exactly the way her father had always intended it to. Back at the diner, Walter helped her wedge a flathead screwdriver beneath the raised tile near the counter, and together they worked it loose, the old grout cracking away in dry gray flakes after 28 years undisturbed. Beneath it sat a rusted iron ring set into a wooden hatch, and when Ruth pulled it upward with both hands, hinges shrieking in protest, a narrow set of stone steps appeared, descending into darkness, and a smell of cold earth and old wax that seemed to rise up and meet her like a held breath finally released after 28 long years of holding it. Walter offered to go down first, out of an old-fashioned instinct toward caution, but Ruth shook her head, some quiet certainty rising in her chest that whatever waited below those steps belonged to her, and to her alone, to meet first, after 28 years of waiting patiently in the dark for exactly this moment. She went down first, Walter close behind her with a flashlight, and the beam swept across a cellar far larger than the modest diner above it seemed to promise, a room Frank must have quietly expanded and reinforced over months, maybe years, without a single soul in Millbrook ever knowing. Wooden racks lined one entire wall, built solid and level, clearly the work of a man who intended them to last decades rather than years, and inside them, undisturbed under a soft gray blanket of dust, rested row upon row of wine bottles, dozens and dozens of them. Their labels faded, but their corks still fully sealed, exactly the kind of collection a careful, patient man might assemble slowly, quietly, across an entire lifetime of Tuesday drives nobody in the family ever questioned closely enough. Walter let his flashlight beam rest there a long moment, silent, clearly doing quiet arithmetic of his own behind his eyes, 40 years of surveying land, teaching him exactly how rarely a discovery like this one ever turned up beneath an ordinary floor. Ruth reached out and touched one bottle with a trembling finger, and Walter, reading the faded label over her shoulder, let out a low whistle. "This is not diner wine, Ruth," he said quietly. "This is the kind of bottle that gets its own auction listing." Neither of them said the word valuable out loud yet, but the word hung there in the cold cellar air all the same, humming just beneath the surface of everything. Neither of them wanted to say too soon, the way you hold your breath in church before the choir finally begins. Behind the last wine rack, bolted directly into the stone foundation wall, sat a second discovery, a heavy iron strongbox with a lock far too modern and far too serious for a man simply protecting bottles of wine. Walter tried 3 old keys from his own ring without success, and finally admitted that a box built like that one would need a proper county locksmith, someone trained to work a mechanism this old without destroying whatever sat waiting on the other side of it. Ruth spent that whole night back at the small motel off Route 9 unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man builds a hidden vault beneath a failing diner just to lock something so carefully away from his own family. The locksmith came the following morning, a patient, unhurried man named Gary Odom, who had driven up from the next county over, and who took nearly 40 minutes working the ancient tumblers, listening with his ear pressed close against the cold metal, before the lid finally gave way. With a heavy, final metallic groan, that seemed to echo through the whole cellar. Inside, resting neatly on top of everything else, as though it had been placed there deliberately, waiting, sat a single yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, and addressed in Frank Callahan's own unmistakable, slanted handwriting to exactly one person in the entire world, my Ruthie, when you finally find this. Ruth's hands shook so badly that Walter had to help her open it, and inside, her father's voice rose up off the page as clearly as if he were standing beside her once again. He wrote that the boundary fight with Earl Whitfield in '98 had frightened him more than he ever let on, that county lawyers had circled the 26 acres behind the diner like vultures, and that he feared, rightly or wrongly, that a public court fight would end with the land seized, sold, or lost entirely to men who had never worked a single day of it, men in county offices who had never once set foot on that back acreage, but who could still, with enough paperwork, take it from a family that had. He wrote that he trusted courts less than he trusted stone and steel, and that he trusted no one, in the end, quite as completely as he trusted her, a trust he had never once spoken aloud while he was alive to say it. So Frank had done what a stubborn, private man does when he trusts no system to protect what matters most. He built his own vault beneath his own floor, and he filled it, patiently, over years, with things a courtroom could never touch. Wine collected quietly through an old army buddy turned collector in the trade. Coins and eventually gold traded slowly, patiently, through a reputable dealer in Burlington he visited alone nearly every other Tuesday for close to 20 years. The very drives Ruth had once mistaken for nothing at all, for simple restlessness, for a widower's need to get out of the house. She read that line twice, feeling the shape of her entire childhood quietly rearrange itself around a truth she had never once suspected, every Tuesday absence suddenly making a kind of sense it never had before. Beneath the letter, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and stacked in 2 neat rows, sat 40 gold bars, dull and heavy, and entirely unremarkable to look at, the kind of thing that could sit quietly in a cellar for decades without a single passerby ever suspecting what rested just beneath their boots. Ruth lifted one bar with both hands, startled by its sheer, dense weight, cool and solid against her palms in a way that felt almost unreal, and understood, for the first time in her life, that her father's silence had never once been about hiding wealth for its own sake. It had been about protecting her, quietly, patiently, for 28 long years. At the very bottom of the strongbox, in a stiff leather folder tied shut with string, lay the deeds themselves, documents proving that Frank Callahan had legally owned the full 26 acres behind the diner all along, land the county had quietly assumed for years belonged to nobody in particular, unfenced, unfarmed, forgotten. A brand new state highway expansion project, approved just 18 months earlier and slated to run directly along that exact stretch of acreage, had recently made the parcel more valuable than anyone in Millbrook, including Ruth herself, could have possibly guessed even a decade earlier. An independent appraiser drove up from Burlington 3 days later at Walter's insistence, along with the county assessor herself, a brisk, thorough woman named Patricia Nguyen, who examined every bottle, weighed every bar, and reviewed every deed with the same unhurried seriousness Walter had shown from the very beginning. Patricia moved through the cellar slowly, notebook in hand, saying little, and Walter stood near the stairs the entire time with his arms crossed, watching Ruth's face rather than the treasure itself. Her final numbers landed like thunder in that small, dusty diner. The wine collection alone appraised at $180,000, the gold at $1.2 million, and the 26 acres of newly valuable highway-adjacent land at $2.3 million. Figures she read aloud twice from her own clipboard, just to be certain nobody in that room had misheard her. $3,680,000 in total. Sitting quietly beneath a diner, that had been sold to its own rightful heir for exactly $1. A young estate attorney named Sophia Reyes, whom Walter had called in the moment the deed surfaced, examined the paperwork line by line and looked up at Ruth with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet satisfaction. "These deeds do more than prove ownership," she told Ruth. "They establish a legal claim that predates and directly conflicts with the power of attorney your son used to sell your house. Which means, Mrs. Callahan, that document may not have been nearly as ironclad as your children believed it was when they walked you into that notary's office." Sophia promised to file the necessary motions with the county court within the week and told Ruth plainly that she had, in her professional opinion, an unusually strong case, stronger, she admitted, than most she had seen cross her desk in years of estate law. Ruth sat down slowly on an overturned milk crate in the exact spot where she had stood as a small girl stacking coffee cups and let the full scope of it settle over her at last. The wine, the gold, the land, all of it hidden for 28 years. Beneath a floor her own children had called worthless, without ever once bothering to look underneath it, without ever once wondering why a stubborn old man had guarded a failing diner so fiercely for the last 2 decades of his life. She was 61 years old, and for the first time since Michael's funeral, she felt something steady beneath her feet again, something that felt, unmistakably, like the ground finally holding her weight instead of shifting away from her. And 40 miles south, in a kitchen Ruth no longer had any claim to, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from a cousin who had heard rumors moving fast through Millbrook about the Callahan diner and something extraordinary found beneath it. Daniel read the message twice, called Lauren without a word of explanation, and within the hour the two of them were back in the car, speeding north toward Millbrook to reclaim, one way or another, everything they had so carelessly, so confidently thrown away, certain even now, in that particular way, only entitlement allows, that whatever their mother had found beneath that diner, it still somehow, rightfully, belonged to them. Daniel's car skidded into the gravel lot 2 hours later, dust still rising as Lauren threw her door open before the engine even fully stopped. They marched toward the diner entrance like they still owned it, like nothing at all had changed since the day they handed their mother a crumpled dollar bill on a courthouse curb. "Family means everything gets shared," Daniel called out before he had even crossed the threshold. "We're all in this together, aren't we, Mom?" Lauren was already scanning the room behind him, eyes darting toward the loose tile near the counter, toward the open hatch, toward whatever proof of wealth she could find first. She had already rehearsed, somewhere on the drive north, exactly how she would explain that a fair split was only reasonable, only fair, only what family owed each other, a speech she had polished the entire drive without once considering how it might sound out loud. Ruth was waiting for them just inside the door, standing straighter than either of her children had ever once seen her stand. Walter Higgins stood at her right shoulder, arms crossed, jaw set. Sophia Reyes, folder in hand, stood at her left, calm and unhurried. Nobody offered Daniel or Lauren a chair. Nobody offered them coffee. For the first time in either of their lives, the two of them stood in a room where their mother, and not them, held every single advantage. Daniel's eyes moved from Ruth to Walter to Sophia and back again, doing the same quick math he had once done at that notary's table, except this time the numbers refused to fall in his favor no matter how he arranged them. "There is nothing here to share," Ruth said, her voice calm, even, unfamiliar to her own children in its steadiness. Sophia stepped forward and explained, in short, precise sentences, that the deeds discovered beneath the diner predated and legally superseded the power of attorney Daniel had used to sell the house and drain the retirement account. The document, she said plainly, had already been challenged in county court, and the challenge, she added, was already winning, with a hearing date already set and a judge already reviewing the filing. Daniel's confident smile faltered for the first time since he had walked through that door. Daniel laughed first, a short, disbelieving sound, and told Sophia she was bluffing, that no cellar full of junk changed a signed legal document. Sophia simply opened her folder and read the case number aloud, along with the presiding judge's name, and asked Daniel whether he would prefer to discuss the matter with his own attorney present before he said anything further he might regret. Daniel had no attorney standing beside him. He had never once, in his entire life, imagined he would need one, not against his own mother, not over a floor he had assumed for years held nothing more than cracked linoleum and rat traps. Lauren's voice came out smaller than Ruth had ever heard it. "We didn't know about any of this," she said. "We were just trying to help you manage things, Mom. You have to believe that." Ruth looked at her daughter for a long moment and said nothing at all, and the silence did more damage than any accusation could have. Lauren had spent 35 years learning exactly how to read her mother's face, and what she read there now, for the very first time in 35 years, was nothing warm at all, nothing forgiving, just a quiet, closed door where a mother used to stand wide open. 3 days later, in a Millbrook County courtroom, Judge Eleanor Whitcomb reviewed the newly surfaced deeds, the amended 1999 assessment record, and Sophia's motion, and ruled from the bench in under 20 minutes. The house sale was reversed. The retirement account, or its full equivalent value, was ordered returned to Ruth Callahan through a civil judgment against the estate her children had drained. Daniel sat through the entire ruling with his jaw clenched, no phone in his hand this time, nothing left to scroll through, nothing at all to distract him from the sound of his own name being read into the record as the party responsible for repayment. Sophia Reyes did not smile, but Ruth, sitting quietly beside her, allowed herself the smallest breath of relief she had felt since the day she signed away her whole life at that same cold notary's table. Outside the courthouse afterward, Daniel tried one last approach, softer now, almost pleading. "Mom," he said, "we're still your kids." Ruth turned to face him fully for the first time in months. "You were," she said quietly, "and I loved every version of you I was allowed to know. But a liability doesn't get to call herself family again just because the money ran out." Daniel opened his mouth to answer, found nothing there worth saying, and closed it again. Lauren stared down at her own shoes, unable to meet her mother's eyes for the first time she could ever remember. Somewhere behind her ribs, quietly, she understood that no lawyer, no judge, no ruling could undo the phone call her mother had overheard through that thin guest room wall. Lauren said nothing this time. There was nothing clever left to say, no eye roll sharp enough to cut through what had just happened in that courtroom, no dismissive laugh sharp enough to shrink the number Judge Whitcomb had just read aloud into the record for everyone in that courtroom to hear. She stood on the courthouse steps, looking, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely and completely lost, the way her mother had looked standing on a curb months earlier with one suitcase and a single dollar bill. Ruth did not shout. She did not gloat, though she had every right to. She simply turned, walked to her car with Walter beside her, and drove back toward Millbrook without looking in the rearview mirror even once, leaving Daniel and Lauren standing on those courthouse steps with nothing but each other, and the silence they had built between themselves, one small cruelty at a time. The humiliation, at long last, after months of carrying it alone, belonged to someone else now. But as Ruth drove north with the late afternoon sun spilling gold across the Vermont hills, one question sat quietly in her chest beside the relief, steady and unanswered. She had won back everything that was rightfully hers. What she still did not know, driving north with the gold light fading behind her, was what, exactly, she wanted to build with all of it, or who, if anyone at all, still deserved a place standing beside her while she built it, now that she finally understood exactly what she was worth, after 61 years of nobody bothering to tell her. 1 year later, Callahan's Corner Diner stood exactly where it always had on Route 9, except now the sign gleamed fresh red and white in the morning sun, the boarded windows replaced with clear glass that caught the light across a full parking lot most mornings by 7. Inside, red vinyl booths had been reupholstered. The counter Ruth once wiped down as a girl polished back to a warm honey shine, and just beside the register hung a small brass plaque that read, in simple engraved letters, in memory of Frank Callahan, who protected what mattered most in silence. Regulars filled the stools every morning at exactly 7:15, the same hour Ruth remembered from childhood, arguing about weather and baseball, just as they always had, as though the diner had simply been waiting patiently, all these years, for her to come home to it. The town paper had run a small feature that winter, The Widow Who Saved Callahan's Corner, and afterward, more than one stranger had driven in off the highway simply to see the place for themselves, curious about the woman behind the story, and more than a few of them stayed for pie and left. Telling Ruth her father would have been proud of what she had built back up out of dust. Ruth herself worked the floor most mornings, not because she needed to anymore, but because she wanted to, greeting truckers and farmers and school teachers by name, refilling coffee with her own 2 hands, feeling more herself behind that counter than she had felt in 34 years of marriage and motherhood combined. She had hired 4 people from Millbrook that first year alone, including a 19-year-old named Casey, who reminded her, in small, quiet ways, of the daughter she once believed she had raised well. The diner turned a modest profit by spring, nothing extravagant, but honest, hard-earned, and entirely hers, in a way 34 years of marriage and motherhood had never quite let her feel. She kept her father's old leather ledger on a shelf behind the register, not for the numbers written inside it anymore, but simply because it felt right to keep him close while she worked the same counter he once had, refilling the same ketchup bottles, wiping down the same red vinyl decades later, exactly as he once did. With a portion of the fortune Frank had left sealed beneath that floor, Ruth quietly established the Callahan Fund, a small legal aid clinic run out of a converted storage room behind the diner, offering free consultations to elderly widows and widowers across 3 counties who suspected their own families were maneuvering against them the way hers once had. Sophia Reyes agreed to consult 2 afternoons a month without charge, and within the first year, the clinic had already helped 11 different families across 3 counties untangle predatory power of attorney arrangements before those arrangements could cost anyone everything the way they had very nearly cost Ruth everything herself. Walter volunteered there most Thursdays too, reviewing land records for free, telling anyone who asked that he had simply found a better use for 40 years of paperwork than he ever imagined possible in 40 years behind a surveyor's desk. Daniel's letter arrived that spring, 3 handwritten pages, apologizing for the notary's office, for the phone call Lauren never knew Ruth had overheard, for every dismissive word across 34 years he could apparently now remember with painful clarity. Ruth read it twice, sitting alone at the counter after closing, and folded it carefully back into its envelope without writing a single word in return. Forgiveness, she had learned this past year, was not something owed on anyone else's timeline but her own, and she was not yet ready to decide what, if anything, she still owed the son who had once called her a liability in her own daughter's mouth without ever once imagining she would hear it. Lauren had not written at all, not one word in 12 full months, and Ruth found she thought of her less each week that passed, the way a bruise fades slowly until one day you realize, almost by surprise, that it no longer hurts to press on. The moral of it all had settled into Ruth slowly, the way truth tends to when a person finally has room to sit quietly with it. She had spent 34 years being exactly what a marriage needed, then exactly what 2 children needed, then exactly what grief demanded of a woman left alone at 61, and only now, standing behind a counter her own father had built with his hands, Did she finally understand that she was allowed to be something else entirely? Herself, complete, needing nothing more from anyone else to prove her own worth ever again. Not a son's approval, not a daughter's apology, nothing but her own steady hands on that counter each morning. If you have ever spent decades being exactly who everyone else needed you to be, this was the part of the story where she finally learned she was allowed to simply be herself, quietly, completely, without asking a single soul for permission first. On a quiet Tuesday that closely resembled the ones Frank once kept to himself for 20 years, Walter Higgins walked into the diner holding a small sealed envelope he said he had only just found, tucked inside an old surveyor's file cabinet he was finally clearing out after retirement. "Ruth," he said, setting it gently down on the counter in front of her, "there is one more parcel your father quietly bought back the year before he died, and I think, once you see what is written inside this envelope, you are going to want to sit down first." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, pulled out the same stool she had stood on as a 5-year-old stacking coffee cups, and reached for the envelope with fingers that had not trembled quite like this in over a full year, not since the last time her father's handwriting had waited patiently for her at the bottom of a locked strongbox. Inside that final envelope, Ruth found a short handwritten note in her father's familiar slanted hand, along with a deed to a small quiet meadow just north of town, the very spot where she and Michael had married nearly 35 years earlier. Frank had bought it back quietly the year before he died, the note explained, simply so that one day, if she ever needed it, she would have a piece of ground that had only ever held happiness for her. Ruth folded the letter against her chest and let herself cry for the first time in a year, not from grief this time, but from something warmer, something that felt very much like being loved exactly as she was, even now, even from beyond an ending she had never fully stopped grieving. She drove out to that quiet meadow that same evening, stood alone in the tall grass as the sun went down gold over the hills, and understood, finally and completely, that her father had spent his whole life protecting not just her fortune, but her heart, quietly, patiently, in a language of stone cellars and sealed letters rather than easy words spoken aloud. If you have stayed with Ruth Callahan this far, through every humiliation, every locked door, every cruel word from the very children she raised, then thank you, truly, for walking this whole road beside her. Stories like hers are told for people like you, the ones who have given everything to a family and been handed a single dollar in return, the ones who have wondered, quietly, in the dark, whether decades of devotion actually meant anything at all in the end, whether all that giving simply disappeared into other people's lives without ever once being seen or repaid. We wanted you to see, through Ruth Callahan, that it was never invisible, not for one single day of those 34 years, even when nobody around her seemed to be looking closely enough to notice. They did. They always do. Dignity outlasts cruelty, patience outlasts greed, and quiet devotion, no matter how thoroughly it gets dismissed by the people who ought to have valued it most, is never, ever truly wasted. Ruth spent 34 years being exactly what everyone else needed her to be, and it very nearly cost her everything she had. But in the end, it was that same steady, faithful character, the very thing her children mistook for weakness, that carried her through the worst betrayal of her entire life, and out the other side of it, standing taller and freer than she had ever stood before in 61 years. That is the promise of this story, and it is a promise worth holding on to tightly on the hardest days, when the people who should love you best make you feel smallest, that your worth was never actually up to them to decide in the first place. Now it is your turn to tell us something. Somewhere in this story, one moment probably hit you harder than the rest: the crumpled dollar bill, the overheard phone call, the courtroom silence, the sealed envelope waiting patiently for 28 years. Leave one word in the comments below describing exactly how that moment made you feel. We read every single one, and we would love to know which part of Ruth's story found its way into your own heart tonight. Maybe you have your own crumpled dollar bill somewhere, your own locked door, your own quiet cellar of worth nobody has discovered yet, and if you do, we want to hear about that too. Because someone else reading these comments tonight might need to know they are not alone in waiting for their own justice to finally arrive. If this story moved you even a little, please share it with anyone who has ever been underestimated by the very people who should have valued them most. A mother, a father, a grandparent, anyone quietly waiting for someone else to finally notice what they are truly worth. Subscribe if you want more stories exactly like this one. True stories of quiet people finally getting the justice and the recognition they earned decades ago. And remember always, as Ruth Callahan finally learned for herself, standing behind that restored counter on Route 9, never count out the woman they thought had nothing left to give, because sometimes the quietest people are holding the biggest fortunes, and sometimes it simply takes the right floor tile, the right year, the right moment, for the whole world to finally see it, exactly the way the whole world finally saw Ruth Callahan.